issue supporting this motion.
Exactly. Yeah. Resuming debate, reprise du débat. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to be here today. Those of us who have been here for a while have almost seen this conflict roll out in several chapters. Some of us will remember the 2003, the beginning of the Iraq War, when the conflict began with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the conflict that took place in Iraq over that period of time following that. Ended up with almost a civil war in the country, and in 2006, I believe it was, that 2005-6, Nouri al-Maliki became Prime Minister of the country, and there was some hope when he was elected in the country that there would be some elements that would put peace in place and we could build some institutions there that would serve the Iraqi people very well. And unfortunately, he chose to be a leader who was more divisive than helpful. The Sunni minority was soon alienated there, and many of the problems that we are still facing today have come out of the activity of that government and the failure of that government to be able to welcome and to bring people together within Iraq. And it came at a time as well when the support that the government needed there, the strength that was being supplied by some of the military from outside Iraq was reduced as well. And so we saw those kinds of conflicts begin to reemerge in Iraq. We're all familiar as well with Syria and the fact that the Assad family has been in power there for many years. If we remember correctly, Mr. Speaker, I think we're all aware of the fact that that was considered one of the rogue governments. It was on a par basically with North Korea and some others who were seen as sponsors of terror, but also basically terrorist governments that were holding their own people hostage, threatening them, torturing them, and had one of the worst human rights records in the world. And of course, in 2011, when the Arab Spring unrest began in the Middle East, Syria was impacted by that as well. It took a little longer than some of the other countries, but certainly unrest spread there, and soon they began to respond, as they always did, with violent crackdown, and basically a civil war has emerged out of that. And so we find that area in conflict, the conflict that it is in today, and conflict that it has been in so much part of its past. Through all of this time, there were different organizations that were arising and kind of forming and reforming within the area. And in 1999 to 2003, we would see the development of a number of organizations that ended up coming together and then forming what is now known as ISIS or ISIL. And certainly in 2013 and 2014, virtually everyone, I think, was surprised by the sudden emergence and the surge that this organization was able to show and the amount of territory that they were able to take over. And it was interesting, in July 2013, I believe the Syrian government had approximately 40% of the country's territory, 60% of their population, and 2 years later, that they shrunk it to an area of about 30,000 kilometers. So only 16% of the country was controlled by that government. That was an example in Syria, but certainly it was similar in Iraq of the area and the territory that the government lost because they were not able to provide security for their people. We're familiar with the situation that took place in Mosul, the massacres that took place there when ISIL moved through there, and then particularly in the Sinjar Mountains with the Yazidis who were living their lives. They had their own religion, their own culture, and ISIL swept through there, slaughtered as many of the men as they could find, took the women and girls hostage, and many of those young women and girls have been turned into sex slaves. They've been traded, sold, and bought and sold. I had the opportunity to be on the Foreign Affairs Committee last Parliament, and that was a topic of conversation. Several of our meetings was talking about the situation that particularly the Yazidis found themselves in, but many other minority groups in the area, of course, were obliterated by ISIL as it moved through the area. Through all of this, we have been partners in a coalition that has been trying to push back ISIL, and I think particularly recently has been very successful in that. If we see the area that ISIL had earlier on and the area that they have now, we see that they are being forced back, and it can't happen any too soon. We've been very effective. We've been a part of a coalition that started in 2014, kind of on the sidelines of a NATO meeting. 10 countries came together, put the coalition together. Canada was proud to be part of that. And our contribution has been large. It's been in a number of areas. It's covered most of the areas that we see mentioned in the Liberals' motion today, and I want to talk about that a little bit later if I have time. But we've been particularly successful in terms of how we've been able to use our fighter jets. And so our CF-18s have been a major part of the coalition. Canada's been a major contributor to it, and from the information that I've got, we've run almost 1,400, so 1,400 sorties. We've run 800 support flights, aircraft flights, to over 250 airstrikes, and there's been over 400 ISIS targets destroyed. And one of the reasons this is critical is because ISIS depended so much on the oil revenue. They've depended on foreign currency and being able to buy and sell that oil, and certainly we've been one of those countries that has been effective in destroying those targets, being able to disrupt that supply line, and we've seen that recently. We heard my colleague talk yesterday or a couple of days ago in the House here about how those supply lines have finally been disrupted, and they've been disrupted to the point that the ISIL fighters are now fleeing to Libya and other places so that they can get away. They've lost their money, they've lost their source of revenue, they're not able to pay their fighters, and they're starting to have to break down. And it's unfortunate that just at the time when those things are taking place that our government has decided that it's time to cut and run. This is not the right time, not the appropriate time to do that. I want to talk a little bit about their motion and where we've been at it, and I think that a lot of this, from those of us who've been here and understand the situation, a lot of this looks like window dressing, because most of what was going on and what they're suggesting we have been doing, and we've been doing effectively. But I think the one place that we would completely disagree with the government on, amongst others I guess, but the one that's been the focus is the change in the mission. And so when we read in the motion that they want to refocus, we don't see this as refocusing a military contribution. We see it as weakening a military contribution. We've talked here the last few days about the fact that we want to understand why the government would elevate risk. The last question that was asked in here was about that very factor, about the risk that our troops are being put under. Why would the government want to elevate risk? Well, there may be reasons why we need to elevate risk if we're going to be engaged in a situation like this, but why would we be reducing our combat capability at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. And so this government's moving ahead, putting people in place of risk. The questions that we've been asking in the House here, they don't seem to be able to answer them. They can't tell us how they're going to protect our troops that are there. So certainly we just completely disagree with the fact that this refocus is not a refocus. It's a weakening of our military capacity, putting our troops at risk. We talk about, or in the motion talks about improving the living conditions of conflicted affected populations. And certainly we've been a big part of that discussion over the last few years on the Foreign Affairs Committee. We talked a lot, particularly to refugee communities, asked them, what is it that you would like? What can we do to help? And it was actually interesting because in light of our discussion about refugees over the last few months, that virtually every witness who came to committee said, I would like to go back to my home village. If I had my choice, I would like to go back. I'd like to have peace. I'd like to go back to the life that I had before. So whether it was Yazidis or it was Assyrian Christians, whether it was Kurds, they're saying what we would like is for this to be settled so that we can actually go back and live our lives as we did before. We needed to build strong institutions. We continue to have that need in that area, and obviously that's been one of the reasons why when the Arab Spring issues broke out, a lot of people had great hope for what would happen in that area, but the institutions that needed to be put in place at that time weren't strong enough to be able to handle the opportunity that they had. We talk about investing significantly in humanitarian assistance here. We have done that. We've done that in the past. We've been proud of the commitment that we've made. But again, you know what? There's a challenge. In order to deliver that humanitarian assistance, you need to have a secure situation. And we heard time and time again about the challenge to deliver, for example, food aid securely. That food aid was being hijacked, or particularly in Syria, that the government would take over the food aid, and there was no idea of knowing where it was going to get to. So without a strong military presence, without that strong military capacity, you can't even guarantee that humanitarian aid gets to where it needs to go. And so it's all fine and well as the government talks about these things, but we need to understand that they are not going to have the capacity to be able to deliver on the kinds of things that they're talking about. And certainly, we heard, we're down to a minute already, Mr. Speaker, but we've heard from the other side that there's all kinds of reasons why this has happened. Climate change was mentioned. The defense minister has talked about how this is a criminal organization. This is all about criminal activity. The reality is, in order to deal with this death cult, as my colleague called it, we need to have a strong military capacity, a strong military response. We need to be part of a coalition that can do that. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid we're just not doing our job. We're not pulling our weight. We have been in the past. We need to do that again. This government needs to reconsider the direction that it's going.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Listened with great interest to my colleague's speech, and of course enjoyed working with him on many committees here in Ottawa. We heard a rather extraordinary statement from the Parliamentary Secretary for Veteran Affairs just a few minutes ago that she thought the whole purpose of the Liberal mission was to eradicate, and I used the word exterminate, ISIS. She didn't disagree. So it's at least eradicate seems to be the end goal of the Liberal mission. I was just wondering if the honourable Conservative member, if his party agrees that that's the end of this mission, that's the objective of this mission. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, I think obviously what we need to do is we need to get rid of ISIS. We need to get it out of the place. So when I talked a little bit earlier, this ideology is not going away easily, Mr. Speaker, but when I talked earlier about having the witnesses at committee who talked about their status and the fact that they wanted to get back to their communities. That's what everyone basically in these war-torn areas would like to see, is that they have peace and quiet and they can go back to their lives, they can raise their children, they can put their families back together, and certainly we're not going to be able to do that as long as this ideology is being permeated in the area. And one of the reasons that, or one of the ways that we can deal with that is with a strong military capacity. This government is weakening that, and they're not going to be able to deliver the kinds of things they're talking about, like institutional strength, humanitarian aid, without a strong military capacity.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his speech. And I heard, and we continue to hear a number of phrases that are used by the members opposite, such as weakening our military contribution and cutting and running. And I fear that this seriously diminishes Canada's contribution to this and the strong contribution that we're continuing to have by suggesting that removing our jets means that we're no longer providing a constructive contribution to this is seriously concerning. And I'm wondering if the member opposite can explain his comments, and if in fact it is the case that he feels as though our contribution now and those that are contributing is not worth anything.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's actually very interesting to see the difference in the reaction of this government over the last few months to other governments around the world and governments that we would consider to be allies. For example, France, after the November 13th Paris attacks, they've expanded their airstrikes. Right? They thought it was important to expand airstrikes. The United States has expanded airstrikes against ISIS following attacks in Paris, Beirut, Mali, San Bernardino, and they're committed to investing more in the approaches that are working on the ground as well. United Kingdom recently approved a motion to, Mr. Speaker, expand airstrikes. So while our partners understand the need for these, our government has completely failed to understand that. They're pulling back instead of participating, moving ahead.
Questions et commentaires. The
Questions
honourable
and comments.
for North Okanagan Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to reflect back on comments from across the House this morning from the Parliamentary Secretary that they've admitted that there's going to be increasing risk of the troops on the ground, and simply a number of increasing that number is going to multiply that effect. But he also seemed to show no regard for what that risk might lead to, or the number of casualties that it might cause. There seemed to be no regard or no concern for that, as if it was not a concern for them. I just want to ask the member on this side if they would have a different concern for that increased risk, and what his thoughts would be on that.
Honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's increased risk at least two places. One is the increased risk on our troops, and my colleague yesterday asked the minister that very question. Are you prepared to take full responsibility for removing that protection that our troops need? The other place that the increased risk shows up is on our own territory, in our own country. And so, ISIS has been clearly called for attacks against Canada. They want to be able to operate here. Thankfully, to this point, we've been able to hold them back, and we expect that will continue. But I guess the question for the government, if it doesn't believe that threats like these, require some sort of military participation, a strong military response, when would they fight?